Wrap-up session. Eastern Partnership 2020. Recharge and update. Moderator. Tamar Hulordava, Chairperson of the Committee on European Integration of the Parliament of Georgia. Speakers. Stephen Blockmans, Senior Research Fellow and Head of the EU Foreign Policy Unit at the Center of European Policy Studies. Sajjad Karim, former Chair of the European Parliament's EP delegation to the EU-Georgia Parliamentary Association Committee and the EP's delegation to the EU-Armenia and EU-Azerbaijan Parliamentary Cooperation Committee. Claire Moody, former member of the European Parliament, UK. Brian Whitmore, Senior Fellow and Director of the Russia Program at the Center for European Policy Analysis, Washington, D.C.
So, dear participants of this conference, Batumi Conference, dedicated ones who have stayed through until this almost last session, right before the Minister of Foreign Affairs delivers his closing remarks, we have the opportunity to actually go through the entire 2 days that we have spent together in a concise way and give the opportunity to our distinguished moderators to sum up the sessions that have led to the conclusion of this conference. The Eastern Partnership has been our main discussion, of course, and the aim of this conference was to see whether it has worked, what it has delivered, what is coming in the future, whether there is sufficient energy in the Eastern Partnership countries and in the EU to face the future, what are the challenges that are on our way, how we can overcome these challenges, and we have done this in the set of very interesting panels that have led to this final session, where our moderators will be helping us now. Unfortunately, like me, probably some of you had to miss some of the panels and some of the sessions because we were also having this time spent in bilateral meetings. But this session will give us opportunity to catch the most important things from each and every panel. First of all, the question is, what was the aim of the Eastern Partnership? Has it delivered? Has it met the objectives of the architects of the Eastern Partnership policy? What were the main ideas behind? Was it promotion of democratic development? Was it making states more resilient? Was it building economy? Was it building ties between the Eastern Partnership countries? Was it encouraging greater and increased cooperation between the Eastern Partner countries and the EU? Was it all together, everything, all at the same time? Have we actually met the objectives within the past 10 years? 10 years is a good time actually to think about the summing up the results and assessing progress that has already been reached. First, I will give the floor to Katarzyna because her panel was dealing with the issues of democracy, with the issues of values. Has Eastern Partnership managed to contribute to democracy building in the Eastern Partnership region? What are your findings?
Thank you very much, Tamar. I think it was a fascinating conference, and thank you to the organizers for these 2 very productive days. I chaired the panel European Eastern Partnership as an agent of democratic transition. And I think that from the panel itself, we can draw 5 key lessons. Some are pretty obvious, and some I found quite surprising. So the obvious thing is, number 1, the Eastern Partnership can be a strong tool of democratic promotion given there is enough of drive both politically and on the societal level. So if what we saw in Central Europe, you have the entire society, the public opinion seeing the accession to the European Union or integration with the European Union as a major foreign policy goal, such a society is willing to sacrifice more for reforms, for changes, and for democracy. Where you lack this support, of course, this process is delayed and sometimes made completely impossible to pursue. That's number one. Second, when we talk about democratic transition, the whole discussion really evolves around the question of values. What kind of values are we talking about? And of course, the treaties, the agreements are pretty straightforward. We talk about democracy, human rights, rule of law, the respect of international law. So it seems that we know all this. But during the panel discussion, already we saw how in different Eastern Partnership, these values are interpreted. So for example, human rights, LGBT rights. Is LGBT really a European value that has to be taken on or not? We had this discussion here, and most of our panelists were very straightforward about saying that human rights means respecting all religions, all both gender and LGBT rights, and I find that very fascinating. But having said that, we also need to remember in that point two of values that we need to have all of the stakeholders from civil society, churches, and so on involved in these debates. We cannot assume that some of these values will automatically come into life in Eastern Partnership countries, especially that we see even in EU countries big problems with the full respect of these values, not only human rights, but rule of law, for example. And sometimes, I hope not, but democracy itself. Number three, the third lesson learned during the panel is, of course, that we're dealing with a completely new context, where in the 1990s, it was clear that accession to the EU or association with the European Union is a strong driver of democratic transformation. Today, we have something that we call democratic recession throughout the Western world, which means that very often, especially Russian propaganda, focuses on EU countries saying, but look, they don't walk the talk, they don't respect the values, they have major problems. Is this really the model you want to follow? Is this an effective model? Is this a model that really should be emulated? So we need to address first and foremost, within the European Union, the democratic recession. How do we deal with it? Whether it's caused by economic or cultural problems. And this discussion, the jury's out. So we also need to remember when we talk with our partners from the Eastern Partnership that we also look inward, and we know we also have problems that we want to deal with together. Number four, from the panel, almost finishing, is of course the open door policy. Yes, Eastern Partnership was not created with an implicit accession vision, but of course most countries hoped, or at least Georgia, in this case Ukraine, that such an open door policy to the European Union will remain. And I'm very happy to say that on our panel, our German guest, the minister, the Secretary of State for Europe, was very clear on this. He said we need to speed up the enlargement process. So it's a big change. I think the 10 years have shown that there's more and more understanding, not only in Central Europe, but also in Western Europe, that the Eastern Partnership itself cannot be the end goal, that the end goal is accession, and that's good news. And the final thing, of course, is the question of Eastern Partnership and EU enlargement as a civilizational choice. We had a very interesting discussion with the Armenian Minister of Foreign Affairs, who said changes in Armenia have nothing to do with geopolitics. There is no struggle in our country. We're doing our reforms for ourselves. There's nobody influencing us. Not the EU, not Russia. And some of the panelists said, well, that's not fully true, yes? And it is clear that some of those choices are put, especially from the side of Russia, on you. Sometimes you just don't have a choice. And we cannot forget that, that integrating with the European Union is first and foremost voluntary. You do not have to join the European Union. You actually have to do a lot of homework, and you have to know why you want to join the European Union. Whereas on the same side, there is a very strong push from the other side not to reform, not to make democratic changes, because this kind of instability of the region serves the bigger actor in the neighborhood. So that's the key 5 lessons learned, I think, from the panel. And most of these topics, of course, these threads were also visible in other panel. Tamar.
Absolutely. Thank you, Katarzyna, for this recap. And indeed, you touch upon the issues that I'm sure the others will also, we will have to come back to the same issues. But one important aspect, most important aspect, is of course the attractiveness of the EU and its ability to keep attracting. And that is a very important point that you touched upon, the ability of EU to inspire and to create hunger for joining, for becoming the member, for benefiting from this prosperity, peace and stability and democracy. And that is, of course, built on the shared understanding of values. And I fully agree with your findings of your panel on that. And that also is linked with what I wanted to ask Sajjad to comment on, because your panel, Sajjad, you discussed resilience that is developed in the Eastern Partnership countries through the policy of Eastern Partnership, with the help of the policy of Eastern Partnership, with its objectives, through greater economic opportunities, through new opportunities that are provided in terms of connectivity, in terms of investing in education, I don't know, in infrastructure. What are the main findings from your panel? What makes the Eastern Partnership resilient, or has it, in fact, made the Eastern Partners resilient? Because what we see also, the developments in the last 10 years are not all rosy. There are countries of Eastern Partnership that are still suffering, and suffering hard, from very serious issues. And here we are, anyways, talking about increased resilience. Have we, the partnership countries, become more resilient as the outcome of the Eastern Partnership, 10 years, in fact, of this partnership that matters?
Well, Tamar, thank you and good afternoon. The panel that I chaired actually was, for me, a very interesting panel in the end. We dealt with 2 main issues, deliverables and resilience. And it was quite clear that at the end of the debate, there was a very clear message being sent that the 2 are absolutely interlinked. The more deliverability we have, the greater the resilience to deal with the challenges for all of our partner nations. But the one thing I really did take away from it, and I'm going to be very concise in my report back, was that there was a very clear distinction being drawn in terms of how successful we have been over the last 10 years. And that was a division between security and everything else. So whether it was trade, whether it was movement of people, whether it was opportunities that come with all of those, educational opportunities, all of that on one side as compared to the security situation and what has been achieved through the Eastern Partnership in relation to that. Now, yeah.
With your permission, may I interrupt you or ask a question to ask you to actually elaborate on whether indeed you can separate security from everything else? Can everything else prospect if you have a serious questions of security on the same agenda?
Yeah, it's a very good point, and it's what I was hoping to ultimately come to right at the very end. But you know, this very clear distinction was coming across in all of the contributions that were being made. And I think generally we have varying degrees a real sense of when it comes to certain of our partner countries, for instance with Georgia, with the DCFTA, real achievements have been made. With visa liberalization, once again, not just for Georgia, but others also, real achievements have been made. But when it comes to the security aspect, it was clear that maybe we haven't made the sort of progress many of our partner countries wanted to make. And one of the phrases that was used is this idea of more for more isn't necessarily translating when it comes to security concerns. But should more for more really operate when it comes to security concerns? Is security not beyond the more for more principle? So this is one of the things that kept playing out. But really, you know, to my mind, the issue is this, and the lesson is in this. There is, and it's about distinctions again, there's a distinction between the European Union and the capitals. And when it comes to, for instance, accession, and this was something that quite rightly is part of the overall debate and movement, when it comes to the European Union, we see this pretty much as a procedural issue. However, for the capitals, this is a political distinction and a political decision that needs to be made. And I think there's a lesson in that as well for countries that want to move towards accession away from partnership on a graduated basis. And that is that the political considerations and decisions are with the capitals, and that is quite distinct from what we are able to deliver procedurally at an EU level. So ultimately, when it comes to it, deliverables, yes, resilience is tied in with that, but there is a real distinction to be drawn at all stages in terms of what the EU as an EU can deliver and can do, as compared to where the political investment needs to come from the capitals at a nation-state level.
Well, thank you. Clearly, there is the link between the deliverables and the and resilience, clearly. However, it is all the things that we tend to talk about, which is bringing in more economic opportunities and growth, that also requires some sense of stability. And with this, let me ask Brian to come in, because your panel has discussed threats and challenges, and this is actually the good time for you to come in and tell us what were the findings of your panel.
Thank you very much, Tamara, and thank you to the organizers for a great conference. Our panel, effectively, we began by agreeing what we're talking about when we're talking about hybrid threats. And what we concluded is that it is one of two things. It's either the combination of kinetic and non-kinetic means to achieve a military objective, or it's a combination of different non-kinetic means to achieve a political objective. So in the former case, think of the cyber war and the information war that preceded the kinetic war here in Georgia in 2008 or in Ukraine in 2014. In the latter case, think of the electoral interference that we've seen on both sides of the Atlantic, or the use of corrupt networks of influence or organized crime as an instrument of state policy. We included all of these things in hybrid war. There's different kinds of hybrid war. There are four big takeaways from the panel. The first is that hybrid threats are a product of a systemic conflict between two normative systems. We're not in a Cold War right now, but we are in a normative conflict between a system to the West that's based on all the things I hope that we at this conference hold near and dear. The rule of law, the rights of the individual, the accountability of government, the sanctity of contracts, all the things we're taught in civics class. Basically Western liberalism. And to the East, a system that's based on an entirely different set of principles. Patron-client relationships, networks of influence, oligarchic rule, informal rule, arbitrary rule. And this is what has prevailed in Russia over the centuries. This is what the emigre Russian political scientist Elena Ledeneva calls systema. So we have a conflict between Western liberalism and systema. And what are hybrid threats? Effectively, hybrid threats are systema trying to preserve itself on the territory of the former Soviet Union. That's number one. And number two, it is systema trying to expand itself into the West. Because unlike the Cold War, we're not in we don't have two hermetically sealed normative systems. We have two integrated, as a result of globalization, normative systems. And many of us naively believed in the early 90s, in the heady days after the fall of communism, that it would be liberalism that was transferred to the rest of the world on the backs of globalization, when in fact it is also illiberalism, the values of Sistema, that can be transferred to the West on the backs of globalization. So that's the first big takeaway, that this is a product of a systemic conflict. The second big takeaway is that because of this, we need to broaden our definition of security. Security is not something just for foreign ministries or defense ministries anymore, but it has to take into account finance ministries, interior ministries, regulatory agencies. So this is all the whole of government approach. But when everybody talks about the whole of government approach, we got into it a little bit in the panel, what this means in practice. Because I kind of provocatively threw out the question, should NATO expand the kind of ministerials it has? Right now it has foreign and defense ministerials, plus meetings of heads of state and government. Should NATO have finance ministerials, interior ministerials, right? Should we start to think about NATO in a broader sense? Or should leave NATO to deal with the kinetic part of security and let the European Union deal with the non-kinetic branch and have tighter integration between NATO and the European Union? And there was a very interesting discussion about that on the panel, which led me to say, I mean, I thought the most important thing to come out of the Warsaw NATO summit was the EU-NATO agreement. Enhanced forward presence was extremely important, but I think in the long term, it's going to be the EU-NATO cooperation on this, unless we want to talk about transforming NATO into broadening its definition of security. But so that led to an interesting discussion. The third big takeaway was that Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine are on the front lines of this conflict. They are the West Germanys or the West Berlins of this conflict, and they should be their security should be treated as such. Pay attention to what Russia does to these countries today, because it's what they're going to do to us tomorrow. These countries were getting hacked before it was cool, right? And that means, I mean, the logical conclusion of that is that the security of Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine is inseparable from our security in points farther west. We are all Moldovans, we are all Ukrainians, and we are all Georgians. And that was that came out of the panel strongly.
Is that the understanding, do you think, in the European Union, that there is so much direct link between the security of Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine, and the European Union?
Well, I'm the token American in this panel, so I feel funny speaking for the European Union.
We can ask
but I mean,
your opinion.
I am doing my best to get this message out in both my hometown of Washington and every European capital that I speak in.
And I would add to Brian, I think that there's much more understanding than there has ever been. Yes, I mean, I would not underestimate the amount of time we do spend talking about Ukraine, Georgia, in comparison to what was happening 5 years ago, 10 years ago, actually non-existent topics.
Exactly.
Today, they're at the very key of thinking about EU's security.
Yeah, no, I would agree with Katarzyna. There's been a sea change on this. We still have a long way to go, but I think we have to, I repeat this like a mantra because I believe it, not just because I like Georgians and Ukrainians and Moldovans, but because I believe it is true. Your security and our security are inseparable. But we're getting there, I think. The final point on the panel was that we need to move beyond piecemeal reactions to various hybrid threats. We need a coordinated policy doctrine. And actually, this is something I'm working on, so I was able to work some of my own ideas out in this panel. But I think if we're facing hybrid threats and hybrid warfare, we have to respond with a policy of hybrid containment. We have to have a permanent policy in place to contain hybrid threats. What does this mean? First and foremost, it means resilience at home. It means resilience at home. And this was where the good transition between our two panels is. I mean, we have to clean up corruption, we have to clean up offshore, we have to clean up money laundering, because these things are becoming security threats. We have to take steps to end the polarization or alleviate the polarization within our societies, to bring marginalized groups who feel disenfranchised in, because having these disenfranchised groups is a wide open avenue for hostile outside actors. The second thing that came out of the panel, out of this, in terms of this policy, is that there needs to be a policy of hybrid deterrence. right? Russia's been able to get away with everything it's gotten away with because there is no or else. There has to be an or else. So we have to come up with some kind of way to deter hybrid threats. I would argue that we need to deter them using the areas where the West has escalation dominance, for example, in the area of finance, where the West has absolute escalation dominance. The idea of snap financial exercises came up, where we would kind of do in the style of a military exercise, which bank accounts we would close, which assets we would freeze, which properties we would seize in the event of aggression against one of our neighbors, kinetic or non-kinetic or hybrid. And finally, we need to think about early warning systems. We have early warning systems for terrorism. We have early warning systems for nuclear attacks. But we really need early warning systems for hybrid threats. And this is an area where actually the Baltic states have excelled at kind of creating these early warning systems. So those briefly, I hope briefly enough, were the four main takeaways from our panel.
Yes, but actually let me also ask you, I wanted to ask you, in fact, whether we are doing enough. I mean, this is a rhetorical question rather, because we know that we are not doing enough, and you have basically covered what needs to be done also to make us more resilient towards hybrid threats. But what can be done in the context of Eastern Partnership, do you think, to promote our ability to better address hybrid threats in our part of the world?
That's a great question. First of all, we're never doing enough. That's correct. I think the first thing we need to do, and I've actually begun trying to do this, is to identify the factors which make a country vulnerable to hybrid threats. And recent research that I've done along these lines have identified certain variables that are really important. The higher the corruption, the more your vulnerability to hybrid threats. The higher the organized crime presence in your country, the higher your vulnerability to hybrid threats. The higher your polarization, the higher your vulnerability, the lower your public trust, the higher your vulnerability.
But
so
isn't it a closed circle when you are talking about higher polarization, higher hybrid threats? I mean, polarization is in a way also a result of a hybrid.
Not necessarily. I think what Russia does very skillfully is exploits weaknesses that we already have. I mean, we were polarized in the United States before the 2016 election. Believe me, I grew up in the 1970s. I've never known us not to be polarized. Georgia is deeply polarized. I don't think this is just because of the Russians. I think there are actual deep polarizations in your political system and in your society. So this is one of the areas where we need to close the gap. We have to do something about polarization and do something about increasing public trust. Where Georgia does extremely well is on corruption and unorganized crime. I mean, I did a study of the Black Sea littoral states measuring all these variables, and Georgia scores better than EU members Bulgaria and Romania and NATO member Turkey on corruption and organized crime. Where Georgia comes, which is a remarkable achievement here, especially those of us who remember the Soviet Union, when Georgia was considered the Sicily of the Soviet Union and Kutaisi was the Palermo, right? I mean, this was, so this is not a small achievement that now today Georgia has organized crime and corruption lower than many EU and NATO member states. Where Georgia, in that, yes, give yourselves a, that's fantastic. Polarization, there needs to be a lot of work done in that area here. Now, if I were giving this talk in Ukraine, I would be less talking about polarization these days, because the society is more consolidated than I've ever seen it in the post-Soviet period, but I would be talking about corruption, because that's Ukraine's Achilles heel, right? So each of the partnership countries have different Achilles heels that make them weak, make them vulnerable, and I think that it would be a great initiative to kind of identifying these in each country and taking measures to close this gap.
Well, thank you very much. It is clear that our vulnerabilities are the ones that are exploited in this process and then built up on and used by the, we know whom and what. So, in fact, yes, we need to work on fighting this polarization and radicalization. However, if you come to a point where this has been exploited to the amount that the temperature is too high, then it becomes more and more difficult. But we have to work on it. It's a homework. I share your vision on that.
And it's not an either-or question. This polarization is here. We have our own. I mean, Putin is holding a mirror up to our weaknesses, and so, but we have weaknesses, and we can lessen the effect of that mirror by working on our own weaknesses to not give him areas to exploit.
Thank you very much, Brian. And let me now move to Claire Moody. Claire has chaired the panel on empowering younger generations through education and mobility. And that would be a good answer, actually, a good continuation to threats. How would you link the hybrid threats to the education, empowerment of youth in the globalization period when education opportunities have increased, mobility has become easy and accessible? What are our strongholds and strong points we can address the threats with?
Yeah, no, thank you, Tamir. And I think, yes, there was a temptation to start by saying, and now for something completely different, talking about education and mobility. But actually, when we're talking about resilience, this is part of the development of resilience. It's the educational attainment, it's the ability to learn, but actually also that mobility point, because with that comes a greater understanding, comes a greater expansion of horizons, if you like. And that helps to address some of those weaknesses that are exploited. It's a really, I think, it's of incalculable value in terms of its significance to the development of populations and a country's resilience. So during the session, we covered quite a considerable amount of ground, if you like, the work that's being done in Georgia in looking at the issue of youth and working with younger people and their experiences and their development as very much being a cross-cutting issue. So it's one that involves a wide range of departments. I understand it's now going to be under the Prime Minister's remit precisely because of that cross-cutting element. But also looking at mobility, as I have described it in my initial comments, is one of pure benefit. But we know from all of our societies that it is also one of the areas that is put into the contentious arena. And again, the debate was elaborated around visa liberalization, which is a huge benefit, a positive achievement of the EU-Georgia relationship, but it also involves absolutely that kind of policing of it as well, the operation that goes alongside the visa liberalization. And then, crucially, on the mobility point, the sharing of experiences, but with that comes the danger of brain drain and the loss of, those futures, those young people's futures, because actually they see their future as being somewhere else. And the experience of the minister from Belarus and what he talked about, what's being done in Belarus, but I think there's the other panelists also made the point about kind of circular migration, that people go, they learn, but they also, it is crucial that you put in place that resilience, that you ensure people don't just leave and take the benefits and keep those benefits outside Georgia, but actually they're brought back in as well. And question was also raised around working with the diaspora. And equally, it is the responsibility of us in the EU that we develop and deepen those the work that we do, that we collaborate together. And one of the programs that I am most proud of within the European Union is the research program, the largest research program in the world, what is currently Horizon 2020 and will become Horizon Europe after 2020. And that, again, being open, being engaging, that the people here in Georgia have the opportunity to engage with this program. I could wax lyrical for much longer. I think I have
Well, clearly it is, mobility, education, opportunities for youth. There is nothing, this is something where we have to invest, where we have to put energy into, finances into, and also, that is should be coupled, as you say, with the opportunities, creating opportunities for these youth to be, taken back, for them to look forward to coming back and using their skills and knowledge in their home countries. And this is not a problem for Georgia or only for the other countries of the Eastern Partnership, because we have seen that there is the problem of migration and brain drain also in, let's say within the European Union. There are countries that tend to, lose their, people towards the West. So, of course, this is probably a long-term, for Georgia, for other countries of the Eastern Partnership, the problem is greater because the gap is bigger and people are probably more motivated to leave, and that would be, of course, the biggest damage for the future development of our countries to let this happen. So it is of vital importance to invest indeed in education, in employment opportunities, and in the better life opportunities for people in the countries of the Eastern Partnership. And hopefully that is what Eastern Partnership can deliver, because this is actually a better future for all of us. And now with that, let me go to Stephen, because we kept you on purpose towards the end, because although your panel was one of the first ones, but you in your panel discussed actually the topic, which is going to be something that all the other moderators will have to come back to, and that is the life after association, or the life after these first 10 years. What do we do next? Is there enough energy in the future? Can we have sufficient interest in the policy, in cooperation, in this program, in the future, if we don't add anything new, any new elements to the Eastern Partnership? What kind of elements need to be added? Is it a political, objective, a strategic vision that we need to add, or there will be like concrete deliverables that will do the work? What do you think?
Yeah, well, then that's a question to indeed each of the panel or moderators of the panels. Let me first succinctly recap what had been discussed in that panel, which was organized under the title Life After Association, in search of a greater purpose. And perhaps it's a bit of a misnomer, because association is here to stay for a little bit longer, as we all know. But it's, of course, it fits with the search for greater purpose, which is, as the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Georgia reminded us, of course, EU membership. And the task then is, of course, to almost find the steps, concrete as possible, as concrete as they can be, to get to that ultimate vision. And so we had a wide-ranging debate essentially on the notions of membership itself and of association. And as far as membership is concerned, of course, the minister, having defined a roadmap, then paved the way to a discussion with two representatives from member states, the Hungarian foreign minister and the Czech head of the Europe Committee in the Senate. And that already exposed different interpretations of the meaning of membership of the EU at this very stage, where the Hungarian foreign minister clearly propagated, the view of his government that the future of the European Union is that of an intergovernmentally run union of strong states, where state sovereignty, national sovereignty, and strong government are basically the basic tenets. Brushing aside, essentially, concerns about rule of law, as we have seen, which was picked up by other panelists, and notably, I think, the Czech representative, who clearly, stated that trust and mutual solidarity between member states, between their institutions, and their economic operators, as indeed individual citizens, are crucial to not just the operation of the single market, which is beneficial to all and part of core Europe, as we've heard before, but also for the value base, for individual aspirations of citizens. and thereby key of course also as a component of the image that the European Union sends abroad to candidate countries, to Eastern Partnership countries. And in a way, the Polish Minister of Foreign Affairs having said on an earlier panel that any erosion of democratic standards, a rise of illiberal democracy in a way might make it easier for accession with candidate countries and Eastern Partnership countries, was in fact dismissed, as it had been already on the panel by both the Czech foreign minister as well as the Swedish foreign minister, and resonated, I think, partially also through the debate that we had. Credibility of the enlargement process itself was an issue that was tackled not just from the value base, but also in terms of the length that it takes in order to make advances on the accession track. I think it would be unwise, however, to decouple, that debate from the one that I just referred to, and indeed put the onus on the European Union. It is not. As Mr. Tusk said in his opening speech yesterday, the future is in your hands, Georgian hands, as indeed candidate countries' hands. But of course, if you then come back to your question, what are the next steps, and what should the Georgian government, what should other Eastern Partnership countries see as their concrete steps up a ladder? If I would use the imagery of Michel Barnier, and had better prepared my own slideshow in that respect, it could be seen as a sort of inverse of his, Brexit steps of doom, from current EU membership, all the way to a Turkey model, but somewhere in between an association and DCFTA status. If you inverse that model and you depart from the current association DCFTA status of Georgia, what are the next steps up? Recognizing that EU membership is a long way off, and we've heard the discussion before, recognizing also that EEA membership, as has been considered by the Georgian government, but as being cautioned also by the State Secretary of Norway on the panel that I chaired, as raising concerns in some of the capitals of European Economic Area countries for the big gap that needs to be bridged in terms of socioeconomic objectives that are equally high as those set for the European Union membership itself. If you then lower the bandwidth of options basically from association status up and EEA status down, there's a limited amount of steps that can still be taken. And in fact, Georgia is in a good position perhaps to take a very perhaps small but concrete step towards that ultimate goal of EU membership, which is premised on its current free trade agreement with the EFTA 4 countries, the countries that belong to the European Free Trade Association. That free trade agreement might be enriched, buttressed with extra sectorial areas of cooperation, and we can have a discussion in which fields that might stick best. It might also lead to the gradual incorporation of Georgian diplomatic representatives in the institutions of the EEA, of EFTA Secretariat, for example, and lead to a socialization process, not necessarily immediately with voting rights, but preparing basically the ground for the next step, which would be EFTA membership, essentially. EFTA being an international organization in its own right, rather light in institutional setup, rather inexpensive, if I can say it so, to join in terms of operational budget. It needs to be generated, for the organization to run. But a crucial step, if EU membership is to be attained, which cannot, the only other track that can be taken for that is through EU membership, which is off limits as we've discussed, but which leads from EFTA to the EEA and then potentially into the European Union. So there is a clear path essentially, that is marked out for Georgia and for other Eastern Partnership countries that may, fulfill those criteria in due course. Steps which are measurable and can be taken with the necessary preparation, and where over time, Georgia progresses. Whether that's politically sellable is a different matter. I think there is, value enough, though, in being associated to a club of rich, very prosperous member states, third states within Europe that have full access to the single market and that benefit, from the decisions that are shaped
Stephen, what you
within
are
the European
suggesting is great, I think, and it's going to be, crazy to challenge that, because that is a wonderful thing if it can be materialized. However, of course, there are many questions on whether this is practically attainable, precisely for the reasons of economic gap between the countries of our region and the club that you are describing and talking about. However, this is a very concrete proposal. I would like to ask now other panelists to talk about the same issue of prospects for the future, especially now that the whole EU and Eastern Partnership should be focused on this topic of what is in front of us. We have the Eastern Partnership Summit coming up next year in 2020, and we have to have by that time very concrete ideas about what is going to be the shape of the Eastern Partnership for the next 10 years. Whether this is going to be a same policy for all 6 countries, is there going to be a possibility for 3 countries that are beyond association to do something more again, and what, if yes? So I would ask each and every one of you to comment on that, starting with Katarzyna.
Thank you, Tamar. Because we have really only 10 minutes left to close the panel, I just wanted to do a very short poll that I wasn't able to do yesterday among the audience. So my question to you, to everybody here is, if we meet in 10 years here in Batumi for the next decade conference on the Eastern Partnership, do you believe that you will be living in more democratic countries than you are living today? How many of you think that your countries will be more democratic in 10 years from now? Fair. How many of you think less democratic? Okay, and how many don't have any opinion? So the majority of us believe that we will be living in more democratic countries. And I think that is the end goal of the Eastern Partnership. But that will not happen. That will not happen with us, first of all, buckling, as I said, democratic recession within liberal democracies. Second, as Brian said, to foresee the Eastern Partnership countries as the new frontier, where we're fighting for democracy, where we're fighting for these liberal ideas, and including this area in the bigger fight for the values that we all stand for. And I would like, actually, in 10 years from now, to see the Eastern Partnership as a non-existing entity. So an entity in which we might have, bilateral relations with Belarus or countries that will be left behind by their own choice. But the rest of the countries, I hope, will be members of the European Union and will remember an Eastern Partnership just like we remember European agreements for Central Europe 15 years ago as something for the books, historical books, for students to read.
Thank you, of course, for this very optimistic outlook, and
it's an optimistic crowd. I had to be optimistic.
Yeah, you were supported by the vast majority, actually unanimously. Actually, this was the decision of the audience here. So great, and I will ask Brian to come on.
I want to concur with Katarzyna's optimism, and anybody that knows me knows I'm an optimist by nature. Yeah. You spoke of a democratic recession. The thing about recessions is they're followed by booms. And this recession is not going to last forever. And I know this because I grew up in the 1970s, as I said before. And if we think back to 1979, the world, I had more hair and I was younger, but the world otherwise looked pretty bleak in 1979. The Soviet Union was on the march. Western institutions looked like they were on the defensive. We thought our democracies had become dysfunctional. And if you told me in 1979 that in 10 years Poland would be free, in 11 years Germany would be united, and in 12 years, Georgia would be independent, I would have told you need to see a psychiatrist. But all of these things happened. So if we're looking forward 10 years, I expect that this democratic recession will end. I agree with Katarzyna, the European Partnership will not exist anymore because at least 3 of its members will be member states by then. So that's my optimistic prognosis. I hope we can all meet here in Batumi in 10 years' time. I'll probably have even less hair, if any, but I think we'll be in a much brighter time than we are today.
Yeah. Cheers.
Don't look so happy, Tamar.
Well, yes, but what do we do to make sure that we get there, and whether it is the time to take the next step is the question. Because yes, I mean, our objectives are clear. We want to be members. There are countries that have more optimistic outlook than others. Eastern Partnership, it's too often stressed by different member states that Eastern Partnership was not there as a geopolitical tool and it didn't have the promise of the membership. Do we need such a promise? Michael Emerson was saying in the last panel, you know, just base your ambitions on Article 49 of the Treaty of the European Union. And I fully share that. That is a very fair, perspective. Every European country that meets the standards has the chance. So there is no need to ask and keep bugging various EU member states, please grant us a perspective, because the perspective is only an opportunity to get what you want to get, and the perspective is there for everyone if the conditions are present. So, of course, I mean, I'm the one that is I'm an optimist to the maximum extent possible, so I fully share this vision of yours.
These things don't happen by themselves. They take work, but I'm confident from what I know about at least these three countries that the will is there, and this is going to happen.
Yes, and the will is both. It's a societal will, and the government will, and the political class will, and people's will. This is what also Katarzyna started talking about, and that was also very important. And let me ask Claire now, what is your perspective, Claire? What is the future, and what is after the past 10 years of the Eastern Partnership?
Yeah, well, again, from the perspective of the panel that I had the good fortune to chair, and what I should have mentioned earlier is the youth ambassadors who also took part in the panel that talking about their generation and their perspective on this as well. And I think, again, picking up a theme, one of the things that they were talking about in their role is actually their ambassadorial role within Georgia of talking about their experiences and sharing and spreading their opportunities to people across Georgia. And across Georgia, both in terms of the geography, so every part of Georgia, but also every kind of part of the economy as well. And I think that is one of the things I would say has to be about that future point of engagement and mobility is that it is not just, if you're looking at it in the educational context, it's not just at the degree level. It's at every skill level that there is this opportunity of engagement and of development across the piece as well. And again, that I think is crucial, that it is spread through all levels of society. So you pick up that point about divisions and resolving, one of those vulnerabilities, one of those resilience points. And the second thing I would say is that this also has to be seen as something that we learn from each other. So this isn't kind of one-way traffic. It isn't about just the EU benefiting Georgia, but also the benefits that come from that mutual relationship. And finally, one of the points that was raised by Lawrence Meredith was the one that there is currently a consultation open in relation to the future as well, and open till October. So I would say get involved in shaping that future and involved in that consultation as well.
Thank you, Claire. Sajad, what are your final thoughts, and what are your perspective? What do you think the future of Eastern Partnership can be within next 10 years?
Well, in Europe, because of our history, we have a tendency to see time frames in a very different way. But actually on this one, I don't believe we've got the sort of time that we think we have. Our democracies are under threat. We talk about 1979. At that time, we didn't have internal actors actually dismantling our international institutions. And that is the declared aim today of one part of the Western alliance. My country, the United Kingdom, has just very recently been visited by the President of the United States of America, who came with a very clear proposal asking us to walk away from one part of the Western alliance in order to seek favor from another. We are fracturing before our very eyes. And we are taking the view that somehow it will all come right on the night. It will all sort itself out. That simply is not going to happen. We today, as Europe, have declared that we are going to stand and fight for our international institutions, for the legal world order. Now, we cannot do that unless we ensure that Europe itself is intact. Now, how is that going to happen? Now, the key part of that is what happens in our immediate neighborhood, and of course, the Eastern Partnership is a huge part of that scenario. Now, graduated approach, differential approach, yeah, I get all of that. I see how that works. And it is right. That should happen. But at the same time, we need consolidation. And we need that to be fast-tracked. We simply have not got the comfort and leisure of the time that we are used to having as Europeans. The rest of the world, or other parts of the world that are directly pulling the rug right from under our feet, are far leaner and far keener. And we've got to make sure we respond to the pace that they are setting today.
Stephen, if you want to come on that issue.
I agree with much which has been said, and I don't want to rain on a parade, but I think that the Eastern Partnership will still be around 10 years from now, just like the stabilization and association processes for the Western Balkans, even if some of its members have graduated onto different steps. And I hope very much that that is the case for Georgia, and I've laid out what that path might be. I still think there's economic, political, regulatory, financial value in the Eastern Partnership, you know, for states that choose also themselves, you know, to stay at arm's length of the European Union, and for the European Union, you know, to have a platform to deal with them individually as well as collectively. But beyond, I think the viability of the Eastern Partnership, you know, beyond that technocratic approach as a geopolitical policy is really rather limited until the EU itself defines what its strategy is towards Russia. Frankly, you know, a note from, what was it, January 2015 by the High Representative setting out some guidelines on what, you know, the EU's approach towards Russia should be and what Russia should do in order to carry favor with the European Union and normalize relations is not the kind of strategy that we need, and that has been evoked also in the panel that Brian chaired. I think the EU should have a strategy, you know, that is intent on changing the calculation by the Kremlin that it is not in their interest to pursue the way it has over the last couple of years. And that strategy is lacking and will, unless it is defined, keep the Eastern Partnership policy in some type of geopolitical suspended animation. And so, yes, enlargement light methodology may lead, you know, some way, but not the full Monty.
Well, this is really very interesting, and I'm very much tempted to ask you some questions back, but I have received a note to be strictly on time, so that actually makes me stop this now. But I mean, I think the takeaway from the entire conference and from everybody, all the moderators' input in this final session is that initiative should be taken by us, the opportunities are there, the vision is there, the work needs to be done on both ends, on the end of the European Union, where the strategies have to be clearer, vision has to be clearer, communication has to be clearer, including on the issue of Russia, and the work has to be done on the part of the Eastern Partnership countries as well. As we were told in the last panel, impeccable record is going to to be what is going to help us in actually getting our case through. So that is very, very briefly. Of course, there can be much more said about this issue, but I wanted to thank all the moderators that were helping us in organizing this two-day very important conference, and invite the Minister of Foreign Affairs for the closing remarks, and we remain here.
Thank you, Tamar. I would like to also express my sincere gratitude to all moderators for very interesting, thought-provoking discussion, conclusions, summarizing of this discussion we have witnessed during the last 2 days. So temptation is really high to continue this very interesting debate, but as you have mentioned, we have time restrictions, and also staff here, they have to prepare this hall for the reception, which is going to take place in 3 hours. So all you are invited to celebrate very successful Batumi 16th conference. And once again, I would like to express my gratitude to all of you, to all participants. And it was really a privilege and honor for me, and on behalf of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I'm really grateful for your very active engagement, to the very lively discussion during the last 2 days in different panels. Yesterday, I've asked you to be bold, to express your new ideas in order to encourage further discussions about the future of Eastern Partnership. Yes, we have mentioned that this visionary policy initiative was really a very bold step, and we are really grateful. Yesterday, my colleagues from Sweden and Poland, they have been joking that they were calling themselves the father and mother of Eastern Partnership, and also we have also said to our Czech partner that he is a godfather, because the first Eastern Partnership was, the meeting summit was held in Prague. So once again, thank you very much. Thank you very much for this good days spent here in Batumi. And I also promised yesterday that from our side, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs will continue working on reflecting all these ideas in the initiative of the European Union on the modalities and objectives of Eastern Partnership beyond 2020. We are ready to prepare a non-paper and to incorporate all the ideas which have been expressed here, and then to disseminate and distribute among our partners, and also to pave the way forward about the future prospects of the Eastern Partnership. So, thank you very much. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank our staff for organizing this event and ensuring that it ran smoothly, and of course our interpreters who helped us not to lost in translation. My special gratitude to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs staff, to my colleagues who spent sleepless nights during the last 2 weeks, Tbilisi and here in Batumi. And thank you once again for being with us. All your colleagues who came from different capitals, my colleagues from EU member states, Eastern Partnership states, representatives of international organizations, think tanks, and hope to see you again next year in Batumi for the 17th International Conference. And once again, I would like to invite you today at the reception, and our Ajarian colleagues, the chairman of the government of Ajara, he will host this reception, and we hope that together we'll celebrate a very successful event in Batumi. Thank you very much.